Villainous Interlude, Impresario. The victor in a war is usually decided before the first battle has been fought. Prince Louis of Brabant, later 8th First Prince of Prussia, traipsing through Arcadia like some sort of murderous errand boy, had been oddly nostalgic, black-mused, especially with Wekesa at his side. It had been the both of them in the beginning, before they'd ever met Saba or Alea. Their little jaunt through the realm of the Fae had not carried with it the same sense of momentous wonderment he'd felt back all those years ago, but there was something refreshing about being just a man with a sword, instead of the Empress' implacable right hand. Things had been simpler when he was young. The lines between friend and foe had been clear, the dangers understandable. He and Militia had climbed the tower only to then understand the unspoken truth of it. The higher the edifice, the narrower the summit, and the stiffer the winds. These days they spent as much time making sure they remained on top as they did actually ruling. It was like pulling weeds, he'd once told Hai, if ripping out one laid the seeds for a dozen more. He'd put aside the thoughts by the time they arrived at the fortified Camp Istrid, and Sacker had established southwest of Vale. The city itself had been taken without contest before he'd left for Marchford, abandoned by the rebels. They'd only occupied it long enough to make sure no armed insurgents would be hitting their supply lines. The combined forces of the 6th and 9th Legions theoretically numbered at 8,000, though in truth they came closer to 10 with all the camp followers and support personnel. Leaving a garrison in Vale had not been an acceptable option, not when the Countess Marchford's host numbered 20,000. Half of it peasant levies, admittedly, but quantity could have a quality of its own. Wekesa dismissed that ridiculous chariot pulled by winged horses his husband had gifted him years ago, as Amadeus rolled his eyes. He dismounted his own horse and allowed the necromantic construct to be led away by a legionary. "You'll be up to your neck in scheming soon, I imagine," Warlock asked. "I have a few irons in the fire," Amadeus agreed. His old friend grimaced. "I'll be in my tent then." "Drinking. You always get irritatingly smug when a plan comes together." "I do not," Black replied, but Wekesa dismissed the words with an absent wave of the hand as he walked away. There was no way to win with this lot. He'd always made a point of not gloating even if the enemy was dead, but Hai had promptly informed him that he made such a point of not gloating that it counted as doing it. They never let anything go, really. He'd worn leather pants once at age 16, and it had taken them 20 years to stop mentioning it every time they went drinking. It would be another 20 before he lived down Stygia, and since Nehibkau now led 10th the whole, negotiating with a dragon, affair would likely follow him to his grave. Sighing, Black made his way to the command tent. Eudokia was already waiting inside, the pile of parchments that followed her like an obedient dog stacked on a table as she read through his correspondence. Amadeus cast a curious look around. "Saba." "Gone hunting outriders," Scribe replied without looking at him. "On a horse, I hope." The plain-faced woman shook her head, and he almost frowned. The days where Captain had relied on him to cow the beast were long gone, but if she let it out too much, she still had issues. He'd have fresh meat rations set aside for her. He'd barely poured himself a cup of wine when the generals arrived, Istrid striding in without bothering to be announced, and Sacker following close behind. He'd always liked Istrid Knightsbane, in all honesty. She had weaknesses as a commander, but she was not above taking advice from her staff to make up for it, and she was viciously loyal. Sacker was another story. Though the two greenskins were as sisters, after all those years working together, the Goblin General had never been part of what could generously be called the Loyalists in the Legions of Terror. Sacker had been a matron before becoming an officer, and though the official word was that no goblin could sit on the Council of Matrons, while serving in the Legions he'd always suspected she was the eyes and ears of the Council in the army. She would look out for goblin interests above everything else. "Warlord," Istrid greeted him, clasping his arm. "Istrid," he replied, then nodded at Sacker. "General." Lord, the goblin murmured. The eye she'd lost at the hands of the lone swordsman's attack had been replaced by a well-crafted glass one, and most of her burns had been healed through sorcery. The part of her face that had been touched by magic was not as wrinkled as the one that was untouched, making her look like she'd grafted the skin of a younger goblin on her face. The effect was somewhat gruesome, and knowing her she'd been leveraging it ever since. Countess Talbot ain't moving, Istrid told him, accepting a cup of wine when he poured it. Sacker shook her head when offered the same, her single living eye watching them carefully. She's not retreating anymore then, Amadeus said. Good, I was beginning to think she'd march all the way to Holden. She's trying to bait us into joining up with your apprentice and sieging Lys, Sacker spoke quietly. That way they can cut our supply line and fall on our backs. Catherine has Lys in hand, he simply said. So now the blades come out, eh? Istrid grinned nastily. About time. It'll be like old times stomping a Callowan host into the ground. Black sipped at his cup, still standing. Sacker let out a small noise of amusement. There's not going to be a battle, is there? She said. Not as such, no, he agreed. Within 3 days the Countess' army will collapse. Istrid looked like he'd just stolen a dozen sheep from her pens. We have them, warlord. We force a battle here, and it'll be a massacre. That's what we're trying to avoid, Scribe said from her corner. Both generals jumped, though Sacker much less noticeably. Neither of them had noticed Eudokia was in the pavilion. People rarely did, unless she wanted them to. A pair of hasty lady scribes later, Black cleared his throat. Half of that army is peasant levies, Istrid, he said, farmers and craftsmen. There was a moment of silence. We kill them, and there's no one to till the fields when the time comes, Sacker immediately grasped. And there was the reason the goblin was slated to be the next marshal, even with her mixed loyalties. She had an ability to grasp the larger picture that Istrid simply lacked. It's not a coincidence that they started the rebellion just before sowing season, Amadeus said. Countess Talbot is holding all of the fields in the south hostage. If we break her army too badly or burn the farmland to smoke her out, there will be food shortages in Pries. We've become too dependent on Callow for grain and fruits since the conquest. He'd tacitly allowed that to happen, with Malicia's blessing. Food went into the wasteland and luxuries into Callow. The trade relationship between the two lands bound them together tighter and improved the lot of the commons on both sides. Keeping the standards of living for the lower classes high enough was the keystone of killing rebellious sentiment in its crib, both in the wasteland and in the former kingdom. Well-fed, gainfully employed individuals tended to think twice about throwing in their lot with rebels. They had too much to lose. No fight at all then, Istrid asked disgruntled. I didn't say that, Black mused. I'll need your wolf riders ready for deployment. I am not of a mind to let rats flee the sinking ship. Istrid grunted, and from the look in her eyes Amadeus knew she'd be among those riders when they left camp. Peace was not something orcs were particularly fond of, and the Nightsbane less than most. Crows are already gathering for what's to come, Istrid. All you have to do is wait. Morning came and word trickled out from the enemy camp that the Duke of Lys was dead. Amadeus had ensured as much last night by slipping Scribe a piece of parchment with the words Gaston Khan, Duke of Lys on it. Since being raised by a school of hired killers had left Assassin with a particularly vicious sense of humor, the Duke had been found drowned in his own chamber pot. Relatively tame, Black decided, compared to some past killings. He blamed a twisted upbringing. The people who'd taught Assassin had used as a graduation exercised the murder of a target by use of as innocuous a tool as possible. Men had been killed with teacups, he'd been told, filing cabinets and even once half a blunted copper coin. Assassin's own graduation exercise had been the murder of every single other assassin, using them against each other. The other named had a rather thorny take on irony. Buttering his bread, the green-eyed man paused to take a sip of tea as he watched the green fields ahead of him and the rebel host beyond them. He'd had his table set at the edge of the fortified camp, a handful of blackguards looming behind him in a concession to safety. Not that they were particularly necessary, given the very lethal wards Wekesa had set around him before stealing most of his bacon and flouncing off to bother Saba. Ahead, the Calawan army was milling aimlessly like an anthill that had been kicked, hamstrung by the death of the man they'd been rebelling to put on the throne. Duke Gaston had been little more than a figurehead, while Countess Elizabeth ran the campaign as his military commander and betrothed. But figureheads were important when you assembled an army drawn from the commons. The man's claim had derived from being the highest-ranked remaining Calawan noble, and from some extent that the ancient Dukes of Lys had once been kings in their own right, which put the rebels in a spot of trouble. The only duchy with a ruler left in Callow was the Duchy of Dina in the north, where Duchess Keegan still watched events unfolding with her armies assembled at her capital. She was not a participant in the rebellion, though, and more than that, nobody wanted a Dioreth on the throne. They might have been a people admired by other Calawans, but they were not liked. Scribe dipped a wheat biscuit in her own teacup, a truly horrible habit. He frowned at her, not that she cared. "Why only the Duke?" she asked. Black had been about to reply when he felt a flicker at the edge of his awareness. The pest had arrived. The wandering bard sat on the edge of the table with a grin, though it disappeared rather quickly when he casually palmed a throwing knife and flicked it at her head. The blade would have buried to the hilt between her eyes had the Asheron not come out of existence as smoothly as she'd appeared. Amadeus raised an eyebrow. As he'd suspected, that was not teleportation. And it did not appear to be controlled. Another flicker, and the bard reappeared in front of the table, frowning. "You know that's..." Black's shadow extended behind him, casually adjusting the aim of a mounted crossbow towards the heroine and pulling the trigger. She flickered out of existence before the bolt could tear through her lungs. The next time the pest reappeared, she was standing 30 feet ahead of him. A tendril of shadow snuck across the grass as she glared. "Gotta say, you're being kind of a D." The tendril punctured the ground, setting off the demolition charges buried under the heroine. Black took a bite of his bread and chewed thoughtfully. The wandering bard did not reappear. Thrice beaten and she stayed gone then. He thought that would do the trick. Names like bards lived closer to patterns and were able to use them, but they were also more closely affected by them. None of the times where she'd been gone had been willingly triggered, he assessed. Odds were she did not control where and when she went. More than that, if the ability had not been teleportation, the implications were interesting. How could you be somewhere and then somewhere else, if not teleportation? Simply by being there, he thought, although that brought other questions with it. The appearances were not instantaneous. Where did the bard go when she was not in creation? Possibly a pocket dimension. More likely nowhere. Power did not come without costs, certainly not power of that magnitude. No wonder she drank. "What were you asking again?" he asked Scribe after a moment. "Why you had only the Duke killed," she reminded him. "An apt question." "Because the rebels are no more a monolith than we are," he said. "As we speak, Countess Elizabeth is likely trying to put herself forward as the candidate for the throne, and she does have the most troops under her command. She is, however, widely disliked by the other nobles. Gaston picking her as a bride was a slight to the Marchioness Vale, whose rank is higher even if she is not as wealthy or militarily capable. The Countess also despises and is despised in turn by the Baroness Dormer. Something about being rivals over the hand of the shining prince in their youth. The Baroness is currently in Lys, but she is extremely popular with the men she sent here. That leaves the Baron Holden, Scribe noted. The Countess' cousin once removed, he'll support her. He would, Black agreed, had I not told you to send that letter to Grem last month. By now he'll have received a messenger informing him that Nekhob is torching the odd barn in his holdings and that a cohort of undead is driving his landholders into the city. Not any real damage, you understand, and deaths will be avoided, but to scared civilians it will make no difference. He'll want to return to protect his lands. It's an ingrained instinct in Calawan aristocrats. You're dividing them, Scribe said, setting them against each other. Under the cover of dark, if I am not mistaken, the men from Dormer and Holden will desert, Black shrugged. Those from Dormer heading towards Lys, the others towards home. That cuts down on their professional troops by a third. It didn't, if you counted the mercenaries. 4,000 dwarven veterans, the heaviest of infantries. But since he'd had Eudokia deal with that matter already, there was no need to belabor the explanation. As for the Baron Holden, if he followed his men in desertion, and Black was fairly certain he would, Istrid's wolf riders would be taking him. Only when he was out of sight, though. It would not do to discourage desertion. Amadeus took another sip of tea. It was a beautiful day. Wekesa was hogging the wine, as he always did. Saba was tearing into a barely cooked side of lamb, looking vaguely guilty as she did. She avoided that kind of behavior around her husband, who'd never so much as glimpsed the beast, but she did not need to be so delicate around other calamities. They'd all seen her in the fullness of her wrath, tearing off heads effortlessly and bathing her fur in blood. Black poured himself a cup of Oxum Red before Warlock could finish it, slapping away the retrieval spell. The smug-looking sovereign of the red skies tried to hook around the jug. The army looks smaller than it did yesterday, Wekesa said, trying to distract him as he pilfered some couscous from his plate. Black refrained from rolling his eyes. Warlock only descended in petty thievery like this when he missed his husband too much, though when they'd been younger he'd also done it purely to spite the others. Until Hai had nailed his hand to a table anyway. His lover did not brook threats to her morning tea. She'd apparently picked that up from her father, who'd been an admiral among the Teodal until a defeat at Yan Te Hands had forced his exile. How he'd managed to cross the Tyrian Sea was a story in its own right, as was the way he'd romanced one of the few elves to ever leave the Golden Bloom. Amadeus patiently bid his shadow to form teeth and began sawing through the back leg of Wekesa's chair, but he deigned to reply. The soldiers from 2 baronies deserted during the night, he told them. His prediction had been mostly accurate, though he'd somewhat underestimated the impact of the Duke's death. At least 1,000 men from the levies had melted away under the cover of darkness, smelling a losing fight. Istrid had gone to follow the unfortunate Baron Dormer with all of her wolf riders before dawn came. They had standing orders to retreat if a hero showed up, but otherwise the outcome of that fight was settled. They still have most of their knights, Saba said, clearing her throat and setting aside the clean bones of her meal. They do, Black conceded, and though we've proven we can deal with them now, they'll cost us unnecessary casualties if they fight. Unlike the levies, they won't desert easily. They badly want the return of chivalric orders, and only a restoration of the kingdom can accomplish that. I still have that plague for horses you had me cook before the conquest laying around somewhere, Warlock offered. That kind of weapon is hard to put back in the box when it's come out, Black declined. Anyhow, the matter is handled. Can't be too handled, the horses are still there, Saba pointed out. Amadeus reached for his wine and found the cup empty. There was a very suspicious magical siphon at the bottom of it, and Wekesa hadn't refilled his own cup in some time. The Black Knight glared at the other man, who grinned mockingly. He set the teeth to saw faster. Contrary to what many treatises preach, Black said, I don't believe that morale shocks off the battlefield are better off delivered all at once. Several consecutive blows bring the expectation of more to come. That perception comes in more useful than one instance of great panic. He's still hiding more tricks up his sleeve, Saba translated for the benefit of absolutely no one. I haven't been around for too long, Warlock said. He's gotten to. The back leg broke, and the sovereign of the red skies sprawled on the grass in a messy heap. Amadeus stole his cup of wine, pointedly not smug to such an extent it looped back around to smugness. The third morning showed another chunk of the rebel host missing. The dwarven infantry had disappeared during the night, though not before quietly butchering most of the knights in their sleep. Their contract, though paid with Prosran silver, had technically been held by the Duke of Lys. The fig leaf had been a necessary fiction for First Prince Cordelia, who could not be seen to be too directly involved in the rebellion if she wanted popular support. Black had simply hired the dwarves in advance for when their contract with lease expired, and had the man killed. After that, their orders were to stay for a single day, wipe out the enemy cavalry in the night, and march back to the Ways Elite, where barges would take them down to Mercantes. It had been a hideously expensive measure to take, and he'd had to designate a route for the mercenaries to follow that wouldn't allow them to loot most of southern Calais on their way out, but the results spoke for themselves. The rebel army was falling apart at the seams, fights breaking out between supporters of the Marchioness and the Countess. The levies were staying mostly out of that, leaving the squabbles to the retinues of nobles, but seeing their only remaining real soldiers take blades to each other was the final nail in the coffin of their willingness to wage this war. Which was why Black had quietly sent envoys to the most prominent leaders among them, and asked for a parley halfway between the armies. Idly trotting up on his horse, the Black Knight bade it to stop in front of the dozen men and women who eyed him warily without ever touching the reins. Those were an affectation, as he controlled his mount entirely through his name. Now and then enemies tried to seize them to unhorse him, and got a blade through the throat for their trouble. "Good morning," Black greeted them politely. Disbelieving glances were exchanged among the envoys, to his mild irritation. Why did people always expect him to be uncivil? Being evil was no reason to be rude. Even when it was necessary to execute someone, there was no need to be unpleasant about it, and he had no intention of killing any of these people if they did not force him to. "Good morning," a heavy-set blonde woman in her 50s replied, sounding as if she did not quite believe what she was saying. One of the men, dark-haired and scarred by what he absent-mindedly decided to be a legionary's blade, spat to the side. "Ain't come to exchange pleasantries," the man said. Black cocked his head to the side. The face was almost familiar, but then a lot of these soldierly types were. "I've met you before," he said, "summer home." If it had been on the fields of Striges, the man would not be here to stand. The soldier blinked, then shook his head. "Laura," he replied, "was in command at the Muddy Gate." "Your men held for half a bell," Amadeus remembered idly. "Ranker thought you would be the first to fold, but she always did underestimate the royal guard. You were next to last." "Good soldiers, all of them," the man glared. "Most of them dead now." "Yes," Black spoke softly. "They fought well, they fought bravely, and they died." He had not raised his voice or used his name to inflict fear, but a shiver went through them nonetheless. Alea could weave lies so beautiful you wanted to believe them, and Wekesa could turn a man mad with 3 words, but Black had always preferred to use truth. Nothing cut quite so deep as an unpleasant truth. "You here to threaten us then?" a young woman spoke belligerently. "Do I need to?" he asked. "You know who I am. You know what I can do. Worst of all, you already know how this ends. It's the reason you're standing here in the first place." "We still got numbers on you," another man grunted. "I could carpet this plain with the dead," Amadeus said frankly. "Make this a victory so brutal the fields of Striges would pale in comparison, and they were bloodier than most. But I don't want to, you see." "Yeah, you're a real bleeding heart," the young woman from earlier said. Black smiled. "What's your name, young lady?" She paled, but after so much bravado she was too proud to back down in front of the others. "Amelia," she replied, chewing her lip as she did. It seemed the rumors he could steal someone's soul just by knowing their name had not quite died out in these parts of Calais. "I'm a very bad man, Amelia," he said. "What I am not is a wasteful one. I could slaughter the heart of southern Calais people today, but all that would accomplish is the making of corpses. Corpses don't grow crops. Corpses don't pay taxes." "Neither do rebels," the old soldier grunted. "So cease being rebels," Black shrugged. Just like that, the woman who'd returned his greeting asked, "We just walk away?" "Go home," Amadeus offered. "Go to your families. No sanctions will be imposed, no additional taxes levied or property confiscated. And the next time a lord comes to you with coffers full of Proceran silver talking of freedom, remember today. Remember that mercy once is an investment, but twice is a mistake. And I do not make mistakes, went the unspoken sentence. There is a price, of course, he said, and they stiffened. Some smiled with triumph, confirmed in their private belief that evil could never negotiate in good faith. Callow was a land of old grudges, lovingly tended to. The nobles, he said, the ones who took the silver, give them to me. He leaned back in his saddle, then smiled at them. You have until nightfall to think it over. His horse wheeled away without a word as hushed whispers erupted among the envoys. Before the two bells had passed, fighting erupted in the rebel camp, but it was all a foregone conclusion. Marchioness Victoria Lernus of Vale and Countess Elizabeth Talbot of Marchford were dropped off bound and gagged at the edge of his camp by men who wouldn't meet his eyes as the army started dispersing into the countryside. Some of the retinues had not fought and still lived. They would be an issue later on, he knew. He'd have to assign a legion to the area to prevent the rise of banditry. The nobles were brought to his personal pavilion, where under guard they were allowed to wash up and compose themselves. Amadeus only entered afterwards and calmly invited them to sit. Marchioness Victoria, he greeted them, Countess Elizabeth. They were both in their 40s, though even he did not look it, he was older than both of them. The Countess of Marchford was fair-haired and still roughly handsome, though too sharply boned to have ever been a great beauty. The Marchioness had dark hair braided and showing thin streaks of gray, her blue eyes watery but unblinking. Neither of them showed the fear he knew they felt. The Carrion Lord himself, the Marchioness said, should I be honored? Come now, Victoria, the Countess mused. Anything less would have been a slight. Though mere hours before they had been at each other's throats, in the presence of the enemy they closed ranks without hesitation. Of all the qualities of the people of Callow, he had always admired that one best. Priests never ceased sharpening their knives, even when the enemy was knocking at the gate. I would receive your official surrender if you would care to give it to me, Black said. Oh, I don't think so, the Marchioness chuckled. The Countess smiled. Your offer, though kind, is declined. As the commander of the armies of the Kingdom of Callow, I must inform you that our official reply is go fuck yourself. Give me 100 officers with that kind of backbone, and I'd conquer all of creation, Black thought. I expected as much, Amadeus said. Countess Marchford, the offer I made you after the conquest still stands, a position as general at the head of a legion as well as amnesty. You don't really get it, do you? The Marchioness laughed. I wouldn't flip Elizabeth a copper if I saw her on the street starving, but I would never, not for a moment, think she'd make a truce with the enemy. We were born free, Prissy. That's not something you forget. The Marchioness of Vale is correct, Elizabeth Talbot said calmly. We both know how this ends, hound of militia. The noose, the chopping block, or whatever else your butchers in the East can think up. She leaned forward, meeting his eyes. I would do it again, Carrion Lord, she spoke hoarsely. Even knowing how it ends, I would do it again. There were a few heartbeats of silence, then he sighed. What an utter waste, Black murmured. But the gears were turning, and didn't that say everything that needed to be said? He rose to his feet. Crucifixion, he said. Returning to Triumphant's favorite, I see, the Marchioness replied, though she paled. A legionary will be along soon with a pitcher of wine, Black said. It will be poisoned. A painless one, you'd fall asleep and never wake. Whether or not you drink is up to you. Nailing your dead body to the cross will have the same effect as if you were alive. Villains must be graceful in victory, he believed. They knew defeat a lot more intimately than the other side. With a respectful nod, he left the two aristocrats to their last moments. The rebel army had died without the kind of battle that would make a pivot in the story unfolding across Callow. Lys would be the closing of the rebellion, Lys and Catherine. Looking up to the darkening sky, Black hummed an old song his mother had taught him. It had been a beautiful day, but he'd always loved the night best. Book 2 Interlude, Rats. 3 can keep a secret if 2 are dead. Unless you're a necromancer anyway, then the world is your blasphemous undead oyster. Dread Emperor Sorceress. About the only thing Ratface missed about the War College was the easy availability of good writing tables. Out on campaign, he had to make do with a movable scribe's desk, which did not contain nearly as much paperwork as he actually needed it to. Juniper's insistence that everything be done by the book meant that reports like bread like vermin, and he'd only barely managed to remain ahead of the curve, since ate her by prioritizing what was immediately necessary. The backlog kept growing, and even what passed for his staff, 3 unassigned literate legionaries he'd nabbed before someone could draft them into a higher priority chore, wasn't enough to cut down the mass properly. Eris, may she be devoured by 100 different tigers, had dropped off what must be every single scrap of parchment her people had ever written on all mixed together. The Tagreb could almost admire the elegance of following an order to the letter in a way that defeated the purpose it had been given for, but as it happened, he was the one stuck holding the sharper with a lit fuse. Still, he'd gotten some things out of the mess. For one, Eris had meticulously kept track of how much she fed her former slave soldiers, and had apparently obtained those supplies by paying out of her own treasury. The rations had been nothing spectacular, but they'd been nutritious and systematically on time. Slaver she might have been, he thought, but at least she had taken care of her slaves well. There was something to be said for that, though it did not make the act of buying men any less despicable. In the days before the Mizans, both the Saninke and the Tagreb had practiced slavery themselves, but after being on the other side of the whip for a few centuries, that concept had been forcefully excised out of their cultures. Oh, some of the high lords treated their subjects little better than slaves, but though they might lay claim to the days of their followers, they never claimed ownership. There was a difference there, one that had been taught to visiting free city slavers through gruesome executions and at least one magical plague. The records on the Prosrin mercenaries were much vaguer, and Ratface was fairly certain this Arzashal character was skimming off the top in both loot and pay. Likely Eris tacitly allowed as much to keep him in her debt, ready to out his indiscretions to his own men if he ever misbehaved. Said men were unfortunately loyal to their leader. He'd found out when probing their allegiances. They were well aware that they were in a foreign land surrounded by hostile forces, and not even gold on the side was enough to loosen tongues, not of men with any authority to speak of, anyway. It was standard practice among wasteland to try to bribe your enemy's troops to betray them, so most of the nobility made a point of matching any bribe offers if those were presented to them. He'd put hand to flame. Eris had done the same. She was a traditional woman in many regards, that one. For now, he was making do by reading robbers' reports whenever they were handed in, but eventually he'd find a Prosrin with more greed than sense. Eris, real counsel, was her assembly of priestly lordlings, and those were beyond his reach to infiltrate, but orders had to go somewhere. A pair of ears in the right place would allow the 15th an idea of what she intended when she would turn against them. They'd gotten caught off guard at Marchford, but that would not happen twice on Ratface's watch. May he swallow 100 crows if he lied. Already he knew she'd gone to work putting out her version of the events in Pries. His contacts in Ader had reported as much. Apparently, Catherine had meddled in things beyond her understanding, and Eris had been forced to step in for the sake of the Empire, putting the tower's interests above her own by saving a rival. No doubt the nobility were hiding smiles beyond their gasps of surprise, knowing the Callowan wretch had been outwitted by superior priestly wiles once again. Some days, most days, Ratface was of the opinion that taking a hatchet to every lord and lady of importance in the Empire would go a long way towards making the place run more smoothly. The real danger was if Eris managed to get her lies entrenched in the people's minds, which could make a lot of trouble down the line. Thankfully, Prisi were so naturally cynical about any rumor putting the nobility in a positive light that many people were inclined to dismiss the story outright. Word of the Battle of Marchford had already trickled out in the legions posted in Callow, though, according to a few friends, and their sides had been swiftly picked. If the choice was between rooting for Hicarian's Lord Apprentice and the daughter of Istrid Nightsbane or the daughter of High Lady Tasia, it was barely a choice at all. In the legions, Eris was openly blamed for the demon being summoned. Whoever had been hired to make Lady Acua the savior in that story had botched the assignment pretty badly. Unfortunately, Ratface did not have the resources to start rumors of his own. Not outside the 15th anyway. That kind of work took gold and contacts, both of which he was short on. Whenever Catherine and the Hellhound got around to appointing a Cashera tribune, he'd hand off the entire problem to them. But until then, he'd have kept the 15th afloat as best he could. The Legion's entire hierarchy was a mess, even more now that they'd gotten reinforced. Normally, a full legion would be run by a general and their staff, under which stood 2 legates commanding a Jesha of 2,000 legionaries. The 15th wasn't a full legion, though, and Juniper not a general. They'd gone on campaign with only 2,000 men, which had made her a legate. Commanders like Nock and Hune usually numbered 4, and were responsible for a cabally of 1,000 legionaries each. But even now that the 15th numbered almost 3,000, they remained the only officers of their rank. Both cabally were overstrength, though detaching Robber's cohort of 200 as an independent force had cut down on that to an extent. Aisha's purpose as an officer was to keep all this organized, a hellish nightmare on the best of days. Ratface's tendency towards sympathizing was mitigated some by the fact that she kept denying his own requests for additional staff. Known leaks in the Legion had made the staff tribune very tight-fisted with the kind of security clearance needed to work under him. Ratface sighed and fished out one of the parchment rolls from the overdue pile, this one inherited from Nock. The orc had never been great with numbers and leaned heavily on Nilin to handle his supply requests, which had made the man's death at 3 Hills a minor organizational disaster. Nock's new senior tribune had stepped up since, but Ratface had still inherited quite a few papers when Nilin's affairs had been distributed. This one had been handed separately and later than the others, hence his curiosity. Unrolling the parchment, the quartermaster scanned the neatly written lines while only paying half attention. Old supply numbers from Marchford, he saw. Nothing particularly relevant anymore. Setting aside the scroll, Ratface picked up another and then paused. He picked up the previous parchment again, paying closer attention to the numbers. He'd already gotten a report for Nock's cabally for that month, he remembered. It did not match the numbers he was currently looking at. Some of them were outright absurd, 73 missing scutum. An early draft. No. Nilin was cleverer than that. He'd never been close to the Saninke Tribune, not even when they'd both been in rat company, but they'd known each other socially. Nilin had been one of the most educated people in their company, one of the few who read in his leisure time. And yet the report in front of him could have only been written by a credulous idiot. "Oh, merciless gods," the olive-skinned bastard murmured, "let me be wrong about this." "Sir," one of his staff asked, raising her head from her own pile. "Abba," he said, closing his eyes, "get me one of Killian's mages, one who can scry, and then all of you clear the tent." He got Killian herself. Good. Better to keep this in the family as long as he could. The red-headed mage frowned when he told her exactly what he wanted. "That's a specialized formula," she said. "You're targeting a specific scrying increment without it reaching back. That's fairly sophisticated stuff, Ratface, and you're not a mage. How do you even know about this?" "I paid for it," he replied dryly. There were plenty of mages in Ader who were too weak to be worth forcefully adding to the forces of either the Empress or the High Lords, and they needed to eat just like everybody else. Some of them fell with bad crowds to keep their heads above the water, and Ratface had been swimming in those ugly waters since the day he'd stepped foot in Ader. Nowadays, he was just as home there as all the other predators. "Scrying S restricted at the moment," Killian reminded him, her frown disinclined to leave. "I have a pass," he said patiently. I know, the Dooney said. This just seems pretty shady. Ratface hummed but did not disagree. She'd soon be upgrading that assessment from pretty to very. The fey-blooded woman spoke the formula he'd provided, carefully enunciating every syllable in the mage tongue. Using magic made her look more alive, he noticed, put a flush to her cheeks and a shine to her eyes. He could understand why Catherine was so taken with their senior mage, though he was not interested himself. As a man with a few issues of his own, he could smell the same on Killian buried under the smiling and the gentleness. The spell connected, linking the scrying bowl on the table to a cube of quartz set on a bed table. The quartermaster cleared his throat loudly, bringing awake the shape of a man in a bed. Killian blinked when she recognized the distorted face of Instructor Raman. Instructor Ratface greeted the man. "Good evening." "It's the middle of the night, boy," their former basic tactics instructor from the War College snarled. "What the hells are you doing waking me up? I have classes tomorrow." The dark-eyed bastard raised an eyebrow. "Your tone," he said, "watch it." The man bit his tongue, though even through a distorted image Ratface could see he was furious. "I need you to look into records for me from 5 years ago," he said. "You know I'm not allowed to look at those," the instructor said. "I know you have a key to the room," Ratface replied. "The same one you used to get back into the facilities after nights of whoring and gambling." "Don't say that," Raman whispered furiously. "Someone might be listening in." "You're going to look into the admittance record of a former student called Nilan of Dula," the quartermaster said calmly. Killian jumped in surprise, though her control over the spell did not waver. "I remember him," the instructor said. "Boy on the Imperial ticket from your company." "I want to know who sponsored him," Ratface said. The other man remained silent for a few heartbeats. "That's Tower business, boy," he said. "I'm not getting mixed up in it." "It appears you've come to a misapprehension as to the nature of this relationship," the Tagreb said. "When I tell you to do something, you do it, or I sell your debt to the Night Harpies, who'll collect after breaking your knees and taking a few fingers." "At least I'll still be alive," Raman spat. "A different track, perhaps." "When dawn comes," Ratface said, "I'll be making a report to Catherine Foundling." The instructor laughed. "I'm employed at the War College, boy. We're under the protection of the Carrion Lord." "She can take that away with a single sentence if she scries him," he replied flatly. "I think you need to consider very carefully whether, when I make my report, you want your name to come up as an asset or an obstacle." Catherine had refrained from throwing around her weight in wasteland politics, so far, but she'd gotten pushed by the Truebloods one time too many. More than once he'd seen her talking alone with Aisha, which he took to mean she was finally starting some trouble of her own. Lord Black would back her in this particular matter, he was sure of it. The man was openly protective of his student. When the 15th had been in the process of being raised, word had been put out on the streets of Ader that plucking even a single strand of hair from her head would be met with brutal retaliation. When the mailed fist of the Empress gave a warning, people listened. There were plenty of stories going around about the people who'd been stupid enough not to, and none of them ended nicely. "Have it your way, then," the instructor said. "Now and then that does happen," Ratface spoke sardonically. Nilan had been sponsored into the War College by a minor official called Kadan Lambo. Not, Ratface noted, the headmistress of the local imperial school. That could be significant. Most students on the ticket were picked by the person running their school, though in all fairness meddling bureaucrats were commonplace in Prees. A favor to a promising student not chosen could end up being paid tenfold a few years down the line, should the student rise in authority. "You think Nilan was a spy," Killian said. "I suspect he was a spy," Ratface corrected. The redhead clenched her fingers into a fist. She was not angry at him, he thought, but at the thought that any member of Rat Company could have possibly passed information to the likes of Eris. Ever since the founding of their legion, The former cadets of the company had taken to watching each other's backs around the others. Avoiding that kind of clannishness was one of the main reasons cadets were split among different legions when they graduated, but the 15th was not an average legion in many regards. "We all got offers," the senior mage finally said, after the melee. They did not talk of it among themselves often, but all officers who'd been brought over from the Rats had been quietly approached before they set out for Callow. Oh, and what pretty offers they'd been. D told Ratface he could be reinstated as heir to his father's lordship if he turned his cloak. He wouldn't even have to do much, just send a few messages now and then. He still clenched his teeth just thinking about it. Just a pawn, they'd thought of him. A tool that could be bought so the nobles could keep playing their games with the lives of their inferiors. The Truebloods were a rot in the body of Pries, a sickness in dire need of amputation. And on the day Catherine Foundling wielded the knife that would do away with them, he would be there. Smiling. "What did they offer you?" he asked. "Positions for my parents in Wolof," Killian said. "Gold too, of course, even some magical tomes. Everybody knows the Dooney are a breed of servants, out only to fill our pockets." Her tone was a bitter thing. Even in the college there were some who looked down on Killian for her pale skin. Blood of traitors and invaders, that was the whisper that followed all of the Dooney. Born of the last of the Mesons in Pries, and kept light by intermingling with the Crusaders, who'd once occupied most of the empire. She wouldn't have had to turn Nilin, the quartermaster said, if she owned him from the start. Killian looked ill at the thought. "He was my friend, Ratface," she said. "We used to trade books since neither of us could afford much. And you're telling me he was lying that whole time? Gods, we almost got together during our first year at the college." He'd never been good with emotions, so he remained silent. Eventually she sighed. "Cat took his death hard, you know. She didn't want to talk about it, but she wouldn't look Nock in the eyes for weeks afterwards." Ratface had noticed. They all had. There was a reason Catherine Foundling's men loved her. She repaid that loyalty just as fiercely. "If I'm right," he said, "Nock is going to take it hard." The redhead cursed under her breath. "I hadn't even thought of that. They were like brothers, these two. He relied so much on Nilin to run his cabally. And that was the heart of the matter, wasn't it?" Ratface was under no illusion he could find anything the agents of the scribe could not. But how deep would they really dig when it came to a mere senior tribune? One who had so little to do with Catherine directly. But Nilin hadn't just been a senior tribune, he'd been Nock's closest friend. Anything the orc learned in the highest councils of the 15th, he would then be told. Access to information above that of his rank. Even named could make missed details. "So you've got a name," Killian said. "What now?" "Now," the olive-skinned bastard grimaced, "we talk to Aisha." "You think Nilin was the traitor?" the staff tribune immediately said, face thoughtful. Many things could be said about Aisha Bishara, and he'd thought even more, some of them perhaps a little too rose-tinted, but that she was slow on the uptake was one of them. Some days he wondered why they'd lasted so long as a couple, when they'd both known going in that they disagreed on nearly everything of import. The sex had probably held it together past its natural lifespan, he thought. That part of the relationship had always been an unequivocal success. Ratface directed his thoughts elsewhere before his body could stir at the memory of it. "I'm hoping he was not," he said, "but it needs to be looked into nonetheless." The other Tagreb nodded sharply. He was from Dula, right? The small city in Aksum territory. Killian cocked her head to the side. "You know people there." "I have a cousin," Aisha replied vaguely. The Bishara family's glory days were long gone, Ratface knew, but the bloodline was still prestigious. One of their ancient chieftains was said to have wed the daughter of a Jinn prince, and though the creature blood ran thin nowadays, it was still purer than in a lot of more powerful families. Aisha could still put her hand into an open brazier and feel no pain, or spend an entire day under the sun of the devouring sands and not have her skin burn. That meant the sons and daughter of the Bishara line made good consorts for nobles looking to improve their blood rather than make a strong alliance, and that in turn meant Asia had relatives scattered all over the empire. For a Saninke, that might not have meant much. They murdered even family over minor titles, but for the Tagreb it was different. The tribe, even if it was no longer called that, always came first. No matter who you married, no matter how many years had passed. Unless you were a mere bastard, of course. Then getting rid of you was just good planning. Ratface smiled so that the poisonous fury he felt would not show. They had to leave the tent while she got in touch with her relative, and they got in touch with their own contacts, but within a bell, they had their answer. Cadenlambo had been, it appeared, nothing more than a minor official. No known ties to higher authority. 2 details, though, Aisha said. First, when he sponsored Nilin, there were rumors he was a distant relative. Killian's eyes sharpened. Nilin was an only child, and so were his parents. He used to joke about it. Said it ran in the family. From the well-hidden look of surprise on Aisha's face, Ratface guessed she hadn't known that. She'd only been trying to be thorough. But she has that tone of victory, so she found something else. Something relevant. Second, Cadenlambo had a riding accident in the month following his sponsoring. The quartermaster let out a long breath. He'd hoped. Against the mounting evidence, he'd hoped. A loose end being tied up, he said. It's standard practice when placing a long-term spy, Aisha said quietly. Getting rid of anyone who could possibly give them away. The Truebloods have people in the legions, that much is a fact. He might have been an investment from the High Lady of Aksum. He certainly had the talent to rise into someone's general staff. It could be any of them for that matter. They all have the resources to pull off something like this. Them. The Truebloods. The War College did try to weed infiltrators out, or at least identify them, but some inevitably got through. Not enough to ever cripple the army if there was a rebellion, but definitely enough that the Truebloods would remain appraised of what the legions were up to. Circumstantial evidence, Ratface finally said. We need more. All we have right now is an odd report and speculation. Aisha eyed him with unpleasantly familiar disappointment. You were handed an inaccurate report and you just noticed. Perhaps Juniper is right and we do need to audit your books. That the Hellhound was out to get him was not news. She disapproved of he and Aisha getting involved back in the day and taken no pains whatsoever to hide it. To the extent that she'd said as much to his face. Several times. In retrospective, she might have raised some valid points. It did not make Ratface any fonder of her. I only got it when Nilin died and it dated back to Summerhome, he said a touch sharply. Why? Killian interrupted before Aisha could respond. Why only then? Ratface paused. I don't actually know. Hakram was the one to give the scroll to me after Nilin died. Catherine told him to handle the whole thing since Nock was too upset to get it done. Aisha shrugged, somehow managing to make the mundane gesture elegant. He really wished she wasn't as good as that, or at being beautiful in general. Let us ask Deadhand for answers. Hakram was not sleeping. Ratface was not convinced Adjutant ever slept. He certainly got an amount of work done that implied he was beyond such mortal foibles. The orc was paying Shatranj with apprentice, and apparently beating the warlock's son handily. Both of the named made him uncomfortable, though for very different reasons. He'd known Hakram before the orc had stepped into the realm of legend. Before he'd become Deadhand, the first orc with a name in over a millennium. It was hard to reconcile the sergeant who'd used to badly hide his contraband alcohol with the warrior who was followed by hushed whispers from greenskins wherever he went, a demigod in the flesh to his people. As for apprentice, well, no one who'd ever seen the mage at work would ever be comfortable around him. At 3 Hills, he'd turned an entire flank into a frozen wasteland of death, and at Marchford, he'd lit up the entire night sky with his wrath. So much power contained in the chubby frame of a mild-mannered, bespectacled man, always at the tip of his fingers. "Adjutant," he greeted them, "Lord Apprentice." Hakram's eyes swept over Aisha and Killian before settling on him. The orc clicked his tongue over the roof of his mouth, the gesture strangely human. "You're hunting our rat," Hakram said. "There'll be more than one," Aisha replied. "But in essence you are correct. We think we've identified a leak." "That explains all the scrying that's been going on," Apprentice said. "I was going to have to ask questions about that." The man was distinctly indifferent when he mentioned it, toying with a new trinket in his braids. The bone amulet Catherine had made. He was only aware of its existence because she'd killed an oxen to craft it, and the report had made it to his metaphorical desk. "I got a pile of documents after Nilin died," he said. "Among them was a parchment apart from the rest. Why was it?" Hakram hummed. "It was found in his personal effects, not the papers for the Kabbali," he said. "Hence why you got it later than the others." Killian let out a sharp breath. "Ratface, you said what tipped you off was that there were odd numbers in the report." He nodded slowly. "Adjutant," she continued, "the parchment, did you find it in a book?" The tall orc's eyes were hard now and cold. "Yes." Nilin's personal affairs had been inherited by Nock, but they were held in one of the carts in the baggage train, all of which were under Ratface's authority. Hakram pointed out the right book, and from there it was only a matter of time until they figured out the cipher. Numbers for the page, the last letter of the word for the first letter of the word it actually meant. The message outlined the number of deserters in the 15th to have disappeared in the wake of the fight with the heroes, as well as the casualties incurred that night. It ended with a suggestion of what might be the 15th's next assignment, namely the suppression of the silver spears. "If it's still here, it was never handed in," Aisha said afterwards. And yet Eris had known where to find them and when. The implications of that were unpleasant. Ratface grabbed a few hours of sleep before dawn came. He'd been unofficially mandated to be the one who would tell Catherine, much to his displeasure. She wasn't the kind of woman who took her displeasure at bad news on the messenger, but this was not a duty he looked forward to. Not when he'd had to see that guilty look on her face for weeks after Nilin's death, when she thought no one was looking. The squire had gotten up before he did, he found out. Dressed in a simple tunic and leggings, she was sparring with 5 men from her freshly appointed personal guard, the so-called Gallowborn. The Callowans eyed him with distrust as he claimed a seat just to the side of the sparring ring, several of them moving behind him without a word. It was almost endearing how much Catherine was unaware of the fact that she fucking terrified people, he reflected. The squire was undefeated in battle, that was part of it, but it was the things she'd done that gave people the shivers. She torched Summerhome to flush out a hero barely 2 months out of Laura, killed a monster the size of a fortress with her bare hands, and even being crippled had failed to slow her down. Apparently, she'd strolled into the host of devils at Marchford and casually killed their leaders without sustaining a single wound. Hells, she'd taken a handful of named into battle with a demon and wiped the floor with the thing for half an hour straight in front of hundreds of witnesses. That wasn't the part that really scared the Truebloods, though. It was the way she seemed to gather talent around her effortlessly. She, Dee, brought the most promising student in the history of the War College into the fold with a single conversation. She, Dee, picked a nobody as her liaison, and in a matter of months he'd become the adjutant. The son of the sovereign of the Red Skies took orders from her. She'd taken a company of deserters into battle against devils and somehow turned them into loyal, hardened killers. Men of the Gallowborn had been on report twice since Marchford for beating a man bloody for disparaging Catherine. The second time, when it had been implied the only reason the Black Knight had taken her in was to keep his bed warm, the legionary had to have all of his teeth grown back by a healer. Armored boots were not a forgiving weapon. And now he was watching a woman his own age toy with 5 veterans like they were children, somehow making them run into each other without ever going quicker than at a walk. She mentioned once that she'd never used a sword before leaving Laura, and Ratface honestly had trouble believing it. He's known people who practiced the sword since they could walk who weren't half that dangerous with one, and that was without even taking her uncanny reflexes into consideration. The 15th had not even existed for a year, and already it worshipped at the altar of Catherine Foundling. You only needed to hear the song already written about 3 hills to know that. Squire stopped before her men were too bruised to walk, clapping them on the shoulder amicably before dismissing them. Ratface idly wondered how many of them were already in love with her. Her relationship with Killian was not common knowledge. He'd made sure of that, and named always attracted admirers the way carrion attracted flies. She wiped her face with a wet cloth, though she didn't look particularly sweaty, and then finally noticed him. Catherine Foundling was not a strikingly beautiful woman, he decided. Her face was sharp, almost austere unless she smiled. Her most attractive feature was the long hair that she kept in a loose ponytail. The Dioraith coloring lent her touch of the exotic, admittedly, but compared to the likes of the heiress there was no contest. And yet she had a strange charm of her own. Charisma, not beauty. Ratface, she greeted him with a smile. She eyed him thoughtfully after that. And you look like you just killed my horse, which seems a bit over the top since it's already dead. All right, Supply Tribune, ruin my morning. I'm about due a nasty surprise. The Tagra bastard cleared his throat. We've found one of the spies. You're not going to like it. She didn't, but she listened anyway.